The year is 2012, and a post-apocalyptic survival game about a man trying to care for a girl after an apocalyptic event is released. Now, if you're not super good with dates, then you'd probably think I was talking about The Last of Us, but actually I'm talking about the indie game I Am Alive made by Ubisoft Shanghai. I Am Alive actually predates The Last of Us by a little over a year and actually brings some things to the table that not even the legendary Naughty Dog was attempting with The Last of Us. Now, I remember playing I Am Alive back in middle school, probably a year or so after it came out, and thinking it was pretty cool and liking the combat mechanics back then, but I didn't remember much else other than thinking it was pretty good, but nothing memorable. But after playing this game in 2020, I was actually pleasantly surprised by it, and honestly, pretty surprised the game didn't get more praise back when it came out, especially since it's not like this game was coming from some small indie company. No, this was Ubisoft, arguably one of the biggest companies in gaming. Though they weren't as big as they are now, they still had a few Assassin's Creed games under their belt at this time, so they're pretty well known and respected by the gaming community, so it's a bit odd that the game seemed to fly under the radar so much and not really being mentioned at all since its release. In truth though, I Am Alive was initially revealed to be a much more ambitious and larger scale game, but after years of troubled development, the game was passed to a new studio, reining it in a bit and made to a much smaller scale and runtime in order to finally release. Now, most games that go into development hell like Duke Nukem Forever turn out to be absolute disasters and a mishmash of multiple iterations and ideas, and they're often very apparent in the trouble they experience during development. I'm Alive definitely isn't perfect and shows the corners that it cut due to its troubled and eventually rushed development, but surprisingly, it came out to be a very solid title and successfully delivered on the new ideas it was bringing to the table. Given the game's troubled development and downscaling, it left many people with a sour taste in their mouth upon release, as the game didn't feel like the game they were initially promised, and definitely not one that felt justified in the time it took to finally release, with IGN absolutely hating almost every aspect of the game and giving it a 4.5 out of 10, though surprisingly, on the other side, GameSpot gave the game a very high 8 out of 10, so clearly the game was very divisive for players back when it released. But now I'd like to look at this game from the lens of someone playing it now over 8 years later. Is the game a hidden gem in the survival genre, or is it simply a game that should have been left in the past?
Test. I'm not sure the sound is working. Wow.
First, I want to talk about combat because it's arguably I Am Alive's most unique feature and has a lot of ideas that I wish would have caught on and been in more games in the genre, such as the ability to hold up enemies and intimidating them so you never even have to fire a shot. The combat isn't perfect, and even an hour or two in, some of the cracks show, but the game's choice to try something new kept me engaged with combat despite these issues.
Go!
I Am Alive does ammo economy in an apocalyptic world right. You only have a few bullets at any given time, and I literally only had a max of 2 arrows for the entire game, and I never found any extra shotgun shells. In the apocalypse, bullets are one of the most sought after resources, yet should always be the most rare at the same time. I Am Alive successfully delivers the feeling of that scarcity. There are many times where you'll be up against 2 or 3 guys and you only have 1 bullet to make it all work, and sometimes you have nothing and you have to hope the enemies don't call your bluff. The amazing thing about this though is that the enemies are the same way. Sometimes someone can hold you up and be talking a lot of shit, but once you take them down, you learn their gun also had no bullets and they were just hoping you wouldn't call their bluff. The combat of I Am Alive feels desperate, dirty, and brutal, and everyone's just trying to survive, and they'll use any tactics they can to make sure they're the ones leaving alive. The AI in I Am Alive isn't anything special or advanced like, say, Fear, but the way that they react to what you do and what their buddies are doing around them make it super engaging and tense, as it feels like any encounter can go south at a moment's notice. The developers also really nailed the little details with the system that they went with too, as I had one time where a dude was approaching me from afar after I just killed a group of his buddies, and once he got sight of their lifeless bodies, he went from walking up to me like he was in control to charging me to gain the upper hand. Or how you can kill the enemy with a gun in the group and the rest of the group will just instantly get scared and surrender to you, whereas as long as one enemy has a gun, even the melee enemies will still charge you because they feel they still have the upper hand. It's the little details like this that really make the combat feel fleshed out and unique, even when compared to games coming out now. I think the hold-up mechanic would have been a great fit for a game like The Last of Us 2, and would have fit well with that game's themes of trying to humanize every enemy. While The Last of Us 2 felt that by giving everyone names, we would instantly feel bad for the people we are mercilessly slaughter, I Am Alive lets the unpredictability of fights be the knife in your back, as you're forced to kill someone who charges you, only to find their kids in the next room asking if you saw their parents downstairs, who are now lying lifelessly in their own puddle of blood. Like I said though, this combat system isn't perfect and has a lot of jankiness to it. Like if you're holding up an enemy with your pistol and then you put it away, they'll instantly charge you again as if you just magically don't have that gun at all anymore. Also, I never really found an effective way to deal with two enemies without having to use at least one bullet. The problem is that as soon as you try to melee kill one of them, the other will charge you, so you can really only rely on melee kills for the last enemy in a group or with a surprise attack at the beginning. Also, I just wish the developers had some more dynamic elements to the combat to keep it feeling fresh and unique all the way through. Such as, I would have liked to have seen some kind of shakedown system like Metal Gear Solid 2, where you could hold people up and force them to hand over supplies or drop their weapon. I feel like this would have added more depth to the encounters, as it would have allowed for a much more passive approach to combat, where you don't always have to kill people in order to take their supplies, and instead could have just take what you needed and then leave the survivor behind, which also would have brought up a great morality question of what's worse, killing someone for their supplies or leaving them alive but now defenseless and without supplies. In the end though, I Am Alive understands that in an apocalypse, all it takes is one bullet to make someone feel like a god, and it uses that as a basis for the combat and pulls it off with mostly a spectacular fashion, with a few speed bumps here and there and some wishful thinking from me. Which now brings me to the next highlight of the game, the traversal. Now, stamina-based traversal isn't anything new, and it has really become popularized recently by Breath of the Wild, but at least from my knowledge in games that I've played, I believe I Am Alive is one of the first games to really use this form of stamina-based traversal. This game uses a stamina bar at the top of the screen that slowly starts to deplete when you start to climb or run anywhere, and the real interesting thing about it though, is that once the bar reaches the end, that doesn't mean you instantly let go and likely fall to your death. No, you can actually push through the exhaustion if you need to, but this will permanently decrease your max stamina until you use an item that restores your stamina capacity. So you can have an interesting dynamic created where mismanagement of your stamina can leave you with lasting effects that will make it even harder to traverse in the future. The amazing thing about this is that the negative feedback causes the player to force themselves to get better, as if they don't get better at planning their routes when climbing or running through dust clouds, then they'll just keep further handicapping themselves. And because of this threat of severe consequences for failure and how important climbing is to the game, to the point where I think it'd be fair to say that easily a third of this game's runtime is dedicated to just climbing and traversing the world. So by the end of the game, I was planning out my entire route before I even started climbing at all, as to make sure I didn't make any mistakes and took the most efficient route every time so that I could conserve my resources as much as possible. And for a game that's trying to be as grounded as possible, the stamina system really goes a long way to achieving this, as it really helps the main character really feel like a real person with real limits. But also, humans have willpower and can push themselves to do more than they think possible when they need to, so the main character can push himself past his limits when needed. But it also makes sense that exerting yourself more than you thought possible would also leave you with permanent damage until you relax and eat a meal or sleep. Another aspect of the traversal that helps further the grounded nature of the game is that climbing feels natural. Now, I'm not talking about natural in the sense that the character moves with natural flows and motions, because that's actually the opposite, as the character is rather stiff and rigid when climbing, but I mean what you climb and how you climb feels like it's real and isn't over gamified. What I mean by gamified is that games like Tomb Raider or Uncharted or the Assassin's Creed franchise, which all also rely heavily on climbing mechanics in their games, they'll often make what is and isn't climbable very apparent as to make it easy to traverse and move forward. These games will do things like make certain blocks brighter colors or more pronounced to make it obvious that it's something that can be climbed, or in extreme cases sometimes they'll make climbable areas covered in some kind of paint, dirt, or scratches that make it apparent that someone's climbed that thing before. But in I Am Alive, generally the game doesn't do this, and instead just lets players think logically about what would be able to be climbed. There are things like rebar slightly exposed from concrete that you can climb up like a ladder, but the game never explicitly tells you this and doesn't rely heavily on it throughout the entire game as to make it a trigger for the player to know they always want to climb exposed rebar. Also, there can be false paths when climbing as well. You could be climbing up the side of a building and think just going straight up is the right thing to do, but sometimes taking the most obvious route can lead you to a dead end where you then have to go back and find the correct route, all while you just lost a bunch of stamina going the wrong way, so now you're going to have to use even more supplies to make sure you have enough stamina to go the right way. The game doesn't treat you like a child when you're climbing, and it expects you to be paying attention at all times to make sure you're taking the correct or most optimal route forward, and it won't hesitate to punish you if you don't. That being said though, this more realistic and natural approach to climbing led to a few times where the way forward wasn't very obvious, or sometimes the things that could be climbed were a little too hard to discern from the normal unclimbable terrain. But now is where the cracks start to show and the not so great elements of the game comes in, and not just the little nitpicks here and there, but actually fundamental problems with the game's design. The game from a technical side is very dated, as the character models, texture work, and animations all feel like something that easily could have been on the PS2, and honestly with all the heavy fog from the dust that severely limits your field of view, it gave me serious flashbacks to Silent Hill 2 and how all the first few Silent Hills used fog as a way to hide the limits of what the engines in the PS2 could render, but honestly, even Silent 2 had better texture work than this game. As someone who has done plenty of 3D modeling work, I know how hard it is to make and texture models, but some of this just comes off as lazy and unacceptable. Ubisoft Shanghai is responsible for some of the Splinter Cell games like Double Agent and Pandora Tomorrow, and say what you will about those games as Splinter Cell games, but just looking back, even Double Agent, which came out in 2006, has much better and more consistent texture work than I Am Alive. Hell, the main character of the game, which is arguably one of, if not the most looked at texture in the game, looks terrible at times, with his hair in particular just looking like some wet paper mache stuck to his head. Also, the protagonist looks like a deranged psychopath when you perform an execution kill, as his eyes are seemingly open as wide as can be with an uncomfortable amount of time between blinks, resulting in him kneeling over them like he has clothespins holding his eyes open, which maybe that's the look they were going for, but given the track record of the textures in the game, I would find that hard to believe. Something that is less consistent but just more apparent because of it is the environmental textures. Some of the buildings and cars look pretty on par with what we're seeing in 2012, but some of the textures look like someone just took the textures and then rubbed their ass cheeks all over it before calling it done. The inconsistencies are baffling at times, as having low-res textures on some objects is nothing new to gaming and pretty commonplace even in the biggest AAA games, but usually developers try and limit these textures to the ones that the player won't be seeing for long periods of time, or putting them on objects that the player will see from a far distance, so from a distance the player sees them, it'll look fine to them. But in I Am Alive, there are cars you can literally touch that look like they're from big rigs, and if you know anything about that game, you know any comparison to it can only mean terrible things. On the other hand though, when the textures look fine and you're just walking through all the thick dust trying to scavenge scavenge any supplies you can find, or traversing your way through some dank and dark building as you hear all manners of creaks and groans from the earthquakes deep in the earth trying to make the very structure you're in come crashing down on top of you, that's when this game shines and really shows the developer's ability to create a very thick and oppressive atmosphere, almost mimicking the oppressive nature of the dust clouds in the game world itself. If I had to guess, all of this is a result of the troubled and eventually rushed development of the game, as Ubisoft Shanghai didn't take over until late in development, and they eventually just scrapped the whole original game and started from scratch, resulting in having to make the whole game in a very short amount of time. So as a result, they had to cut more corners than they probably should have, which shows in more aspects than just the texture work and visual design. Which then brings me to the story, which is honestly the most disappointing aspect of the game, as the early sections show a lot of promise and ways for the story to go, but by the end, the story ends up being one that doesn't really know what story it wanted to tell, and tells none of what it does have to say particularly well. The basic premise is that the main character, who is unnamed, has returned to his hometown of Haventon after being away when the event first hit, and he's returned to hopefully meet up with his wife and daughter. The event is never outright explained as to what caused it, how bad it is, how widespread it was, or what it even actually was, but one of the main after effects is there are now frequent and violent earthquakes, which has led to many buildings being destroyed and a thick layer of dust settling at street level on the city, making it very difficult to traverse the streets for very long. Shortly after arriving in the city, you find your old house, but find it to be abandoned and a letter left by your wife explaining her regrets about you and her right before the event happened, which seems to indicate that you and your wife may not have had the best final interaction before the event happened. So after leaving the house to further search for your family, you hear a little girl crying and see that she looks an awful lot like your daughter, so you chase after her to save her from a group of bandits, only to find out that she isn't your daughter, but she's gotten separated from her mother, so you try and help and reunite her with her mother. Now, given this setup, you would think that the story would have been about you and this little girl's blossoming relationship as you try and keep her safe from the horrors of the world, but no, pretty quickly you leave her at a safe location and go back on your own to do a bunch of tasks to help her mother and her friend, and the relationship between the two of you quickly goes by the wayside in favor of a much more run-of-the-mill tale that also just kinda stops. There's almost no character development for the main character or even the side characters, instead just relying on putting you in locations with fucked up people and just sort of being like, wow, that's fucked up. Okay, next location. The story isn't very character or plot driven, and instead really seems to just lean into the struggles of surviving in a world like this and what people will do when the world goes to shit like this. And don't get me wrong, I think the stories it tells with the people you encounter are interesting and really show the depravity that people will go to in an apocalyptic situation, but since it spent the entire intro setting up two different plot lines to follow and then not really developing either, it just gave me a bit of a tonal whiplash. Now, given this game's short runtime of about 4 hours for a first time playthrough, it's safe to say that you couldn't develop a bond with this little girl on the same level of something like Clementine from The Walking Dead or Ellie from The Last of Us, but there's still so many avenues they could have taken this story, and instead they just kinda chose none and go for a cheap emotional moment at the end and expect you to feel something. I think the best course of action for this story would have been to lean more into the main character's relationship with the little girl and her mom, and using his interaction with them to come to terms with the fact that he'll likely never see his family again, so he should cling on to the little bit of life he has with this mom and daughter and go on to protect them even outside of the city. I think this could have given the story much more emotional weight, as well as given the main character more of an arc, though what we're left with was a story with underdeveloped characters and no real payoff in the end, which just left me questioning what was the point of it all by the end. I Am Alive is a flawed game that has some phenomenal ideas and moments that really show what could have been if the game had been given the scope that was initially planned for it. The fact is though that what we got feels more like a tech demo for the features such as the stamina management and the hold-up combat mechanics, which leaves a lot of the other aspects of the game feeling half-baked or unfinished, leading to a very disjointed and unpolished experience at times. But when the game delivers on being a difficult, gritty, and grounded survival game, it really shines as a great example of what the genre is lacking. And because of that, I would love to see this franchise continued and with a new protagonist in a new city to allow us to learn more about how different areas of the country were affected by the event, on top of seeing a new story of people trying to survive in this messed up world, as the potential of the world and the mechanics established in this game could really be interesting if a future sequel was given more time and focus on what worked, as well as trying to make the lacking elements of the first game much more improved. I Am Alive 2 would be a perfect fit for VR as well, as I feel the game is simple enough in the gameplay loop to where it could translate very naturally to a VR platform, and it would really elevate the combat and make it feel more visceral and real like the developers always intended. Also, the traversal and climbing could be exhilarating in VR as you climb skyscrapers and dangle above seemingly bottomless pits. I mean, just imagine walking through a dank and dark subway station and you round the corner only to find a group of crazed bandits huddled by a fire when they spot you and start to inch closer and closer as they slowly close in around you. So you let one get close and then you whip out your machete and stab them right in the gut. Then you pull out your pistol and aim it at the rest of the group when eventually one starts to doubt that it's even loaded, so he charges you. You pull the trigger only to find that you forgot to load the bullet you found earlier, so now you have to scramble to load the mag as he's getting closer and closer. Then bam, you hear the crack of the gun and then he collapses to the ground as you hear him gurgling on his own blood, and the remaining bandits just drop their weapons and run away in fear. And that's just something I came up with in like 5 minutes, so I'm sure with a full and talented dev team, you could do some really amazing things with this franchise in VR with the mechanics already established in this game. The cold hard truth though is that I'm Alive seems to be another victim of a troubled development cycle, but also shows how a simple idea or concept, if executed right, can be all you need to make a fun and satisfying gameplay loop. It's such a shame to see that this game has mostly been forgotten by everyone, as it was just cast aside due to its change in vision and its considerable lack of polish in some areas. I think this game deserves its second time in the spotlight, whether it's a resurgence in popularity in the game or an actual sequel by Ubisoft, no matter how unlikely either of those actually is. Thank you guys so much for watching as always. Don't forget to leave a like as it really helps me out, but if you dislike the video for any reason, don't hesitate to leave a dislike and comment on what I can do better for future videos. Subscribe if you want to see my future content, and I'll see you guys next time.